Welcome to How the Fuck Recoil, the first video in the How the Fuck series in which I describe the various systems I use in my game Ballisticexe. And in this first video, we will obviously take a look at the recoil system. Bear with me. First of all, I guess we need to quickly look at what causes recoil in real life and how it affects a shooter's aim. For example, can you think precisely of why recoil tends to tilt a weapon up? It may involve more factors than you think. Let's quickly create a very simple gun for this so we can illustrate as we go. Please imagine with me for now that this very simple firearm is floating into space. There is no gravity, no forces acting upon it, and it's perfectly stationary. For a bullet to be fired out of a gun, there needs to be an explosion that creates pressure, which acts on the bullet and propels it forward. And physics tell us that for every action there is a reaction. At its core, recoil is the reaction to the action of the propellant on the bullet. The first thing to take into account is the weight of the weapon. While the forces acting on the bullet and the gun are equal, the velocity imparted on the gun will be much smaller, thankfully, because its mass is much greater. Even for our gun in space, our current analysis misses an important factor: torque. Indeed, the center of mass of the weapon is not always aligned with the direction of the force acting upon it. When this is the case, torque is created, which produces a rotational movement. This rotation is greater when the angle is closer to 90 degrees and when the distance between the center of gravity and the force acting point is greater. Now, this may seem complicated, but it's very intuitive if you think of a simple block of wood standing on the ground. If you want to make it fall over, the easier will be to push it at the top, and it will be easier to push perpendicular to it, whereas pushing near the bottom or at an angle, even with the same force, will result in less movement. Notice that even in this extremely simplified case, we already have a first cause for a weapon recoiling upwards when fired, and that is that the torque is directed upwards because the center of gravity is not aligned with the barrel. However, while our analysis is a start, it misses a huge part of the problem. Weapons tend to rarely be floating in space and are more commonly held by a shooter. So let's add one right now. Okay, so for now, we'll think of a non-shouldered gun for the sake of simplicity. When holding a weapon, its center of gravity is no longer its pivot point. The pivot point depends on the shooter's hand placement on the weapon, their grip strength, and arm stability and strength, and much more. So let's call it center grip instead of center mass. But right now, let's actually assume that the shooter can keep the weapon's center grip perfectly aligned with the barrel. Now, the weapon is going to recoil backwards, but at some point, notice that the bend in the wrist of our shooter is reaching a very uncomfortable position. It cannot bend down anymore. You can try it on your own wrist. And since the wrist does not have enough strength to counteract the recoil force in its entirety, it has no choice but to tilt upwards. Note that this happens over a very, very short time, much quicker than even the fastest human reaction time. But even if we assume the wrist has infinite strength and can keep level, the force is going to be imparted to the rest of the shooter's body, and that also tends to provoke upwards movement. The shooter might bend their forearm, and if the shooter keeps all joints perfectly rigid, then all the energy will go into their waist, for example, and it will tend to bend backwards. And if the waist is perfectly rigid, well, the shooter is no the joint, and it tends to fall backwards and aim the weapon up. But let's hope, for everyone's sakes, that we don't have to go this far. One last thing. So far, we talked about the recoil being the reaction to the bullet leaving the barrel. But the gunpowder also leaves the barrel, either as gas or unburnt powder. Since the gas is propelled forward and has a mass, there is an equal reaction in the other direction, just like for the bullet. Keep this in mind, as it will be important for later. Now that we know a little more about recoil, let's take a look at how we might implement it in a traditional FPS maybe. In a traditional game, our weapon is often attached to the player character and kept aligned with the camera. For simplicity, let's attach our gun to the camera right now. Notice how the gun moves with the camera. The player controls the camera with the mouse. Now when the bullet is fired, we can add a rotation to the camera. Then over time, we add the inverse rotation and the camera comes back to its original position. Perhaps you can already see a few problems with this approach. First of all, when the player shoots and the camera goes up, they will try to compensate for the recoil by moving the camera downwards. But then, when we add the inverse rotation back, the camera will now be too compensated and it will aim further down than when we started. Furthermore, when we keep shooting, the camera will keep going up, and that may cause problems. And lastly, our recoil is now completely linear, which feels very unnatural compared to all the complexity that we saw in the first part of the video. We can, however, solve several of these problems at once. First, we'll add a pivot parent to our camera. Let's call it the control pivot. Now, our player doesn't control the camera anymore, it controls the control pivot. But when we add recoil, we'll still add it to the camera. However, we don't add the inverse rotation to go back to our original position. Instead, we simply make the camera go back to 0 rotation over time. This is great because now, when recoil is being applied, we can tell that our camera's rotation is not 0. When this is the case and the player tries to compensate for recoil, we can steal the input from the parent pivot and apply it to our camera instead, like in the old times. When all is done, since recoil has already been partly compensated, our camera is already close to 0, and so it just has to go back slightly, and we're done. With this approach, we can also solve our other problems. Instead of adding recoil in a linear fashion, we will keep track of the camera rotation and use a curve to determine how much rotation we should add. Less at the beginning, more in the middle, and less at the end. This is a very simple approximation of all the complexity we saw in part 1. Lastly, we can clamp the rotation to make sure it doesn't go past what we're comfortable with. Well, even with this simple approach, we can see there are many factors to take into account. Also keep in mind that the explanation here is itself quite simplified. Notice one thing. Our recoil in this state doesn't have that many variables that we can influence. Recoil strength, the speed at which recoil comes back to 0, and perhaps the recoil curve. Now, in most games, this will be translated into a single variable for weapon enhancements, like a recoil factor that will go -1 perhaps. Well, with this in mind, let's take a look at how recoil works in my own game, Ballisticexe. In Ballisticexe, recoil starts with the explosion of the cartridge load. Depending on the mass and type of the propellant, barrel length, bullet mass, and approximate pressure curve, recoil is calculated in 2 components: the reaction to the bullet leaving the barrel and the reaction to the expelled gases. This is where some weapon parts can already reduce the impact of recoil with a property we can call recoil suppression. This would be suppressors and muzzle devices. We can actually redirect expelled gases or mitigate their backwards force. Although this doesn't mitigate the recoil of the bullet itself. Then we assume a certain amount of recoil control. This simulates the shooter's ability to control the weapon and translate the recoil force into backwards linear movement instead of rotation. We can imagine weapon parts increasing recoil control, such as ergonomic grips, handguards, handles, etc. Let's assume in this case that the recoil control is, let's say, 50%. So we now have 50% of the energy that we have to, in some sense, spend as linear movement backwards. Some parts can help completely absorb or dissipate some of that energy. We can assume that the shooter themselves can dissipate around 30%, for example, and some parts can increase this percentage, for example, shoulder pads, buffer tubes, things like that. We can call this property recoil translational absorption. So this leaves us with, let's say, 70% of the linear recoil energy to be applied to the weapon. It is applied using regular Newtonian movement equations, giving us a translation amount backwards, scaled by the mass of the weapon. So the heavier the weapon, the less translation backwards. However, we cannot recoil backwards an infinite distance. If we recoil backwards more than, for example, 10 centimeters, the remaining energy is left over, and we need to keep it aside for later. So you can think of this backwards translation as some kind of buffer, and the few first shots will not feel it. So the first shot will be mostly translation backwards, a little rotational translation. The second one the same. And the subsequent ones, since the buffer is filled, will be more rotation, more and more rotation. And so you can see the shots will recoil more and more upwards, just like they would in real life, in full automatic fire, for example. The maximum amount of translational recoil available depends on the weapon being shouldered or not. Well, now that the translation recoil is applied, we still have 50% of the energy left to spend. Once again, some amount of this energy is dissipated by the shooter, so let's keep 70% of it again. Again, weapon parts may increase or decrease this ratio with a property we can call recoil rotational absorption. This would be mostly, I guess, grips and handles. Now, we mustn't forget that there may be some energy left that couldn't be applied as translation. We must add it here, but only after the rotational absorption has been applied. Now we can use simple torque equations to calculate the rotational velocity imparted to the weapon, once again based on mass but also the weapon's center grip, which is calculated using the weapon's center of gravity and each hand and shoulder placement. Each hand's influence is called by a variable called grip quality. A higher grip quality means a hand will have more influence. A handle wouldn't typically have more grip quality than a handguard, for example. Now all the energy has been spent, and the weapon will be translated and rotated in accordance to the recoil applied. After all of this is done, the shooter will bring the weapon back to its original position. Since both translation and rotation need to be reset, this gives us two new variables, recoil translational restabilization and recoil rotational restabilization. One last thing. When shooting, there is also an effect called concussion, which is a subjective amount of shock felt by the shooter. In the game, this may be translated into camera shake, for example. So we may introduce weapon parts which have a concussion reduction property, reducing this camera shake, typically flash hiders or suppressors. As you can see, where most games content themselves with a recoil reduction property, we now have many variables which all affect recoil in subtly different ways. Now this may seem great, but it also brings a major drawback. It introduces a little too much complexity for new players. To mitigate this, we can cheat a little, and game developers cheat a lot. While variables act differently behind the scenes, we can actually present them to the player with a little more simplicity. For example, let's use the same term, recoil absorption, for both translational and rotational absorption. We can do the same for recoil restabilization. And just like that, we eliminated two variables from our list, while keeping all the complexity in the actual system. Now, more advanced player can of course always learn the subtleties and identify more precisely the effect of each part on the system, and they will differentiate rotational and translational properties based on the weapon part type, but this will be less overwhelming for new players and still offer plenty of complexity. Well, I hope you enjoyed this simplified breakdown of one of the game systems. Let me know in the comments if it was too technical, maybe not technical enough for your taste, or your thoughts on the system itself. Don't forget to wishlist and especially tell your friends about the game. It really helps. You can also join the Discord if you want to suggest a weapon for the game, give your thoughts, or just chat with like-minded people. And I wanted to thank especially all the support I already have on Discord and in the comments. It's a huge help. And I've been told every YouTuber needs an exit catchphrase. So until next time, keep your toes out of the soup and have a great weekend. Cheers!